The Arizona sun beat down like a hammer on steel, heat waves shimmering off the tarmac of Hollister Flight Test Range, a remote base nestled between parched mountains and government secrets. The air was still, save for the distant whir of a service truck and the occasional screech of tires from a test vehicle. Amid the silence stood a lone figure, Elias Ward, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting loosely at his sides, staring at the sleek silhouette of an F-35A Lightning II. The fifth-generation stealth fighter shimmered with a spectral gleam, almost floating above its own shadow. Most saw it as a marvel of technology. Elias saw a memory in motion. He wasn't dressed for the scene. His boots were scuffed, the soles worn down to angles. His janitor's uniform, dust-flecked and faded navy, hung loosely on a wiry frame weathered by time and silence. The patch above his heart simply read E. Ward. To most, he was invisible, a maintenance ghost. "Hey, you lost, old-timer." The voice snapped through the air like a whip. Sharp, smug. Elias didn't turn. "Not yet." I said, "Are you lost?" The voice came again, closer now. Younger, harsher. Elias exhaled slowly, then turned. Colonel Kendrick Ross stood a few feet away, flight suit clean as a showroom dummy, jaw clenched tight with arrogance. He was flanked by 3 junior officers, their smirks cocked and ready. Ross's mirrored aviators glinted as he scanned Elias head to toe. "This here is restricted airfield, Grandpa. That thing behind you costs more than you've earned in 10 lives sweeping hangars. You admiring the paint job, or just forgot where your broom is parked?" The younger officers chuckled. It was the lazy, rehearsed laughter of men who never expected to be challenged. Elias's eyes, the color of worn denim, finally met Ross's. There was no flash of defiance, no insult, only a stillness that unsettled men like Ross, men addicted to immediate reaction. "No, Colonel," Elias said, voice calm, aged unhurried. "I'm not lost." Ross's smirk deepened. "You're just sightseeing then? You do know this isn't a museum, right? That bird's not for decoration. She's a beautiful craft," Elias murmured, almost reverently, not even looking at Ross now, but back toward the fighter. "Sharper lines than the F-111. Meaner too." Ross laughed openly. "Oh, you think you're some kind of expert? What, you used to fly crop dusters in the 70s. More laughter. Elias didn't respond. Not with words. Just silence, steady, grounded, unshaken. And that silence? It irritated Ross like sand under armor. He took a step forward, eyes narrowing. "You know what? Since you love it so much, why don't you hop in and take her for a spin? Give us a little show." The younger officers burst out laughing. It was supposed to be the punchline, the mic drop, the final humiliation. But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't laugh, didn't look down. Instead, he looked directly at Ross and spoke, quiet, clear, immovable. "All right. I will." The laughter cut like someone had flipped a breaker. Faces froze. Ross blinked. The smirk vanished. For a moment, the only sound was the wind brushing across the concrete. And then, somewhere behind that silence, history began to stir. The words hung in the air like a flare over a battlefield. "All right, I will." The smirks died. The junior officers looked at each other, uncertain whether they'd heard a joke or a challenge. Colonel Ross tilted his head, thrown off script for the first time all day. It was supposed to be a jab, a laugh, a dismissal wrapped in mock permission. But the old janitor hadn't flinched, hadn't laughed, hadn't walked away. He'd accepted. "You got to be kidding me," Ross muttered under his breath, then barked louder, trying to reassert dominance. "You serious, old man? You think this is a game? You think you could just hop into a multi-role stealth jet and, relive Top Gun?" Elias didn't blink. "You gave permission, Colonel." Ross swallowed hard. His mouth opened, then closed again. Around him, the junior officers stiffened, waiting for a cue. Pride clawed at Ross's gut. He could feel their eyes, feel the trap of his own arrogance closing around him. He waved toward the hangar crew. "Sergeant Webb, get this guy a helmet, and prep the Lightning. Let's see what our broom-pushing ace can do." There was a pause. A gruff, tan-skinned man in a maintenance vest stepped forward. Master Sergeant Webb, a lifer in the Air Force with too many years and too many missions behind him, narrowed his eyes at Elias, then looked back at Ross. "Sir, we can't just—" "That wasn't a request, Sergeant." Webb clenched his jaw. "Copy that," he said, then turned away, shaking his head like a man being asked to load a casket he didn't agree with. As Webb moved to the equipment locker, one of the younger lieutenants leaned toward Ross. "Sir, are you sure? If something goes wrong, if it goes wrong," Ross snapped, "it'll just prove what we all already know. He's a relic pretending to be a pilot." Elias walked slowly toward the F-35, his boots tapping evenly on the sunlit tarmac. The heat shimmered, but in his mind, the desert faded. The year wasn't 2025 anymore. It was 2006. The air wasn't dry, it was smoke-filled. The tarmac wasn't flat. It was a forward operating strip in Kandahar, where shadows moved like ghosts, and every takeoff could be your last. He remembered a night mission. A call sign, Phantom 6. His bird had taken a direct hit. His co-pilot, Jeremy Echo Mallon, a 23-year-old with a cocky smile and nervous hands, had been bleeding out in the rear seat. Elias had landed the aircraft half on fire, his own arm shattered, his promise made with trembling lips. "If I ever fly again, it'll be for both of us." He came back to the present just as Sergeant Webb returned, helmet in hand. Elias took it gently. The younger crew member who followed carried a flight vest. The patch on his chest read Mallon. Elias froze for a breath. The kid looked up, offering the vest with a small grin. "Didn't think I'd be handing gear to a janitor today." Elias took it without reply, hands steady. It wasn't the name. It was the symmetry. Time had a sense of humor. As he was helped into the cockpit, the crew moved slower than usual, not out of disrespect but disbelief. Elias settled into the seat with an ease that drew silent stares. His hands moved on instinct, harness straps, oxygen feed. Sergeant Webb leaned closer through the cockpit frame. "You ever sat in a Lightning before, Ward?" Elias didn't look up. "Not this model, but I've danced with her older sisters." Webb blinked. That wasn't a joke. It was a statement. His hands hesitated, then fastened the final restraint. Back on the ground, Ross folded his arms again, trying to play it off, trying to hold on to the illusion that this was still just a stunt. But something gnawed at him. A name. Ward. Why did that name itch? Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Elias moved with precision born of decades. His fingers grazed controls like they were familiar faces. Toggle. Press. Switch. No notes. No hosetashchen. His eyes scanned the HUD like he was reading a language the others had forgotten. The pre-flight sequence that took cadets 10 minutes? Elias ran it in less than 2. And somewhere deep in the control tower, a radar tech stopped scrolling his checklist and looked up. Guys, he said to the comm room. Someone just booted up the Lightning with 0 assistance. Heads turned. Who the hell is flying that thing? Outside, the canopy hissed closed. Elias, now helmeted, eyes focused, simply whispered 4 words into the comm. "Tower, this is Ghost." The runway shimmered like a mirage as the F-35A Lightning II rolled forward under the old man's command. But Elias Ward wasn't an old man anymore. Not in that seat. Not with his hands on that throttle. Not with the HUD glowing green across his helmet visor. Its holographic map sinking to a rhythm his body still remembered better than breath. Inside the control tower, a dozen air traffic personnel leaned forward, jaws tight, eyes locked to the digital display. Elias's voice, calm, low, smooth, had just called himself Ghost. And that call sign hadn't been heard in 2 decades. Back on the tarmac, Colonel Ross stood stiff as stone, but his confidence had begun to melt beneath the sun. He was pale now, nervous. The edges of his certainty had curled into doubt. The afterburner flared. With a roar that startled even the veterans on base, the F-35 lifted into the sky like it had been waiting for Elias all along. No hosetashchen, no straged. The machine obeyed him like a trusted hound, fast, agile, deadly quiet. "He's airborne," someone muttered. But what came next silenced even the most skeptical. The Lightning didn't just fly, it hunted the sky. Elias kicked the craft into a vertical climb, G-forces that would make younger pilots black out pressing against his chest, and he didn't even flinch. He leveled off at 15,000 feet and peeled into a tight corkscrew, a maneuver not even standard in training simulations because of the risk. The jet spiraled like a falling leaf caught in a whirlwind, then flattened in a perfect glide. "He's not flying," a junior officer whispered, awestruck. "He's conducting." Elias dipped low, then surged into a reverse Immelman turn, a tight half-loop followed by an inverted roll and a perfect return to level flight. Pilots watching from the ground forgot to breathe. This was combat technique, not performance fluff. They were watching maneuvers built for evasion under fire, for split-second decision-making with missiles in the air. Colonel Ross took a step back. He couldn't even explain what was happening, let alone reproduce it. And that terrified him. Inside the cockpit, Elias's mind was locked in perfect clarity. The jet wasn't a machine. It was memory. It was Echo's voice in his earpiece from that last night. It was the sky bleeding with tracer rounds. It was the sound of wind rushing through a breach in the canopy. It was the cold steel of a dying man's hand gripping his glove and saying, "You live. You fly again. Promise me." Elias had kept that promise buried under years of silence. Until now, at the edge of the base, a black unmarked car screeched to a halt near the tower. The vehicle bore a 4-star flag on the hood. The door flew open, and out stepped General Marcus Thorne, commander of Hollister Flight Range, legend in his own right, and one of the only men who had ever flown Black Ops missions off the grid. He didn't speak. Not at first. He looked up. The F-35 roared overhead in a barrel roll that shouldn't have been possible, too tight, too sharp, too fast. The general's lips parted. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." He watched the jet twist into a near stall, hover, perfectly still, then pivot and scream forward with ghostly control. Only one man had ever flown like that. Only one man had ever made a warplane look like it was painting brushstrokes across the air. Ghost. Inside the cockpit, Elias adjusted the flaps, pressed the throttle, and whispered like a man greeting an old friend. "Still with me, Echo." He didn't expect an answer. But the sky remembered him. The F-35's landing gear deployed with a subtle mechanical hum as Elias guided the jet back toward the same patch of runway he'd launched from. The jet's silhouette shimmered against the low Arizona sun, like a hawk descending onto its perch. On the ground, not a single person moved. Not the junior officers, not the ground crew, not even Colonel Ross, whose face had lost all trace of color. The Lightning touched down as if Elias had measured the air itself. No bounce, no correction. Just a clean, soft kiss of tire on concrete. The jet slowed under perfect control, then rolled precisely back to where it had started. The cockpit canopy hissed open, and for a long moment, nothing. Elias just sat there, breathing, listening, remembering. Then, slowly, he unbuckled the harness, pulled the helmet off his head, and stepped out. His boots met the ground with a finality that echoed across the strip. He looked smaller now, older, but not weaker. Every eye on the base was locked on him. From across the runway, the black car's door slammed shut. General Marcus Thorne, his 4-star insignia gleaming with sweat and dust, marched forward, cutting through the heat haze like a blade. His face was thundercloud dark, his eyes fierce. He had received a frantic call minutes earlier. A civilian had somehow commandeered the newest fighter jet under his command. He had come ready to make someone's career burn. But as he approached and caught a full look at the man climbing down from the jet, everything stopped. His boots skidded to a halt. The officers expected yelling. What they got instead was silence. "Then, Ward," the general said, his voice low, rough with disbelief. Elias looked up. A small smile touched his face, like a forgotten sunrise. "Been a while, Marcus." A wave of stunned energy rippled through the crowd. Marcus? Not General. What was this? But General Thorne wasn't offended. His mouth opened, then shut. He stood taller and raised his hand into the sharpest, cleanest salute any of the junior officers had ever witnessed. "Chief Flight Warrant Officer Elias Ward," he said, loudly now, so the entire tarmac could hear. "It's an honor, sir. Ad honor." I thought you were gone. Colonel Ross's mouth fell open. Warrant officer? Chief Flight? Sir? Elias returned the salute, not as sharply, but with something heavier. Soul. History. I went quiet, he replied. Didn't mean I went away. The general stepped forward and grasped Elias's shoulder. I watched that flight. I knew it. I knew it before the first roll. No one else flies like that. Not in this hemisphere. Hell, not in this lifetime. Around them, whispers broke into hushed disbelief. Ross stood frozen. His lips parted, but he couldn't speak. The humiliation sank into his chest like wet concrete. General Thorne turned slowly to face him. His expression hardened like steel cooling in flame. Colonel, he began, his tone measured but deadly, do you have any idea who this man is? Do you understand the magnitude of your idiocy today? Ross stammered. Sir, I thought he was a janitor. He was just standing near the F-35. I was a janitor. Thorne growled. This man is the reason you even get to stand near that jet. He didn't read the flight manual. He wrote the damn manual. Half the tactics in our current doctrine, he developed them. He has more combat hours than you have hours breathing in uniform. In the mission where I earned my 3rd star, I was his co-pilot. He pulled me out of a burning cockpit with one hand and flew us back on half a wing and a prayer. He jabbed a finger toward his own chest. You wouldn't know the name because most of what he did is still sealed under black classification. But the call sign? That one you've definitely heard. He paused, looked around, and then said it loud enough for the entire base to hear. Ghost. Gasps rose like a ripple through the gathered personnel. A ghost, yes, but one they'd all heard in stories. In legend. Colonel Ross took a step back, lips quivering. His voice broke. Sir, I had no idea. Thorne turned away in disgust. No, you didn't. And Elias? He simply looked at Ross. Calm, kind, but firm. You saw a uniform, he said softly. You didn't look for the man inside it. For a long, suspended moment, the entire flight line seemed frozen between one heartbeat and the next. The desert wind whispered across the tarmac, nudging dust around the boots of men who had suddenly realized they had witnessed something historic, something impossible, something they would tell their grandchildren about. And at the center of it all stood Elias Ward, the man they thought was a janitor, the man they had mocked, the man they had written off as invisible. But ghosts have a way of forcing the living to remember them. General Marcus Thorne kept his salute raised longer than protocol required, longer than tradition demanded. It wasn't a salute to rank. It was a salute to legacy, to sacrifice, to a man who had once dragged him out of the jaws of death at 10,000 feet with a burning cockpit behind them. When the general finally lowered his hand, his expression softened, not with pity, but with reverence. Thorne turned to the stunned cluster of pilots and crew members. Listen carefully, he said, voice low but carrying the weight of command. The maneuvers you saw today aren't stunts. They're combat techniques from missions none of you will ever read about. Missions that bent the laws of physics. Missions flown by this man when most of you were still in middle school. A young airman swallowed hard, eyes fixed on Elias. Sir, we thought he was just what? Thorne barked. Old, quiet, invisible. No one answered. Ghost flew sorties that entire squadrons were built around. He developed the low-yield drift roll used by today's F-35 pilots. The stall hover pivot? He invented it under fire in Marja province. When the manuals say maneuver impossible, what they mean is possible only for Ghost. The shock rippled outward like a detonation wave. Elias shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the spotlight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, almost apologetic. General, that was a long time ago. No. Thorne cut in sharply. You're not just anything. He faced his men again. You all owe your careers, hell, your lives, to pilots like him. The ones who survived what none of U.S. should have survived. Colonel Ross, who had remained eerily quiet, finally stepped forward. His voice trembled with a mix of fear and shame. Sir, I didn't know who he was. I didn't recognize him. I thought he was a nobody, Elias asked gently, interrupting for the first time. Ross's throat tightened. Sir, I am deeply, deeply sorry. There's no excuse. Elias looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far heavier, empathy. A quiet understanding forged from years of seeing young men crumble under the weight of their own pride. He placed a hand on Ross's shoulder. The touch was firm but not harsh. "Colonel," Elias said, "the sky doesn't care about rank. It doesn't care about your insignia, your ribbons, your title. Up there, all that matters is heart, discipline, respect, and the strength to learn before ego blinds you." Ross blinked rapidly, trying to hold himself together. "I messed up," he whispered. "We all do," Elias replied. But only some admit it. Behind them, a line began to form, pilots, technicians, airmen, young and old, hardened and green. One by one, they stood at attention and rendered a salute to the man they had ignored for years. A janitor? No, a myth, a legend. A ghost who had slipped into the background simply because he never needed applause to validate the wars he had survived. A lieutenant wiped his eyes discreetly before stepping forward. "Sir," he said, "your work, your tactics, they're the reason I became a pilot." Another spoke up. "Sir, I studied your maneuvers and training." We never knew the name behind them. A third whispered, "It's an honor to stand in your shadow." Elias looked humbled, almost embarrassed by their reverence. He didn't see himself the way they suddenly did. He never had. In his mind, he was still the young mechanic who learned to fly by watching better men fall from the sky. General Thorne stepped beside him. "Elias," he said quietly, "you didn't just return to the sky today. You reminded these men what it means to wear this uniform." Ross swallowed hard, still standing before him. "Sir, if you can forgive me, I'll resign quietly. I don't deserve this rank anymore." Elias studied him, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve, son. It's about what you learn afterward." And for the first time in his career, Colonel Kendrick Ross understood humility, not the kind taught in classrooms, but the kind delivered by a man who had once danced with death and returned to the ground without asking for applause. The ghosts of the past don't always haunt. Sometimes they teach. By the time the dust settled, literally and figuratively, Elias Ward had already disappeared from the spotlight. He hadn't asked for recognition, nor had he lingered for the applause. He simply handed back the helmet, thanked Sergeant Webb, and walked off the tarmac like a man leaving church after Sunday service, quiet, composed, unchanged. The F-35A Lightning II, still humming from the flight, stood parked where it began, but everyone now looked at it differently. Not as a marvel of aerospace engineering, but as a witness to something holy. That afternoon, General Thorne summoned Colonel Ross to his office. The reprimand wasn't loud, but it was permanent. Ross, still rattled by the collapse of everything he believed leadership was, submitted a formal resignation before sunset. Not out of punishment, but out of realization. He had stood face to face with true greatness and failed to see it. Elias never spoke of the incident again. The next day, he was seen pushing a mop bucket past Hangar 12. Same faded uniform, same quiet shuffle. But no one looked at him the same way. Pilots paused in their routines to salute him, not out of protocol, but out of respect. A few stammered, "Good morning, sir," then corrected themselves awkwardly, realizing he didn't want titles. Some just nodded with reverent silence. Over the following weeks, handwritten notes began appearing on his maintenance card. "Sir, how did you stay calm under fire? Can you teach me how to feel the machine? We heard about Kandahar, about the mission with Echo. I won't ever forget that story." He never wrote back. But sometimes, when the question was earnest, he'd stop beside the young man who wrote it, place a hand on his shoulder, and say one sentence, something vague, simple, but unforgettable. One evening, long after the hangars had gone quiet, a team of junior engineers installed a small brushed steel plaque on a concrete wall near the F-35 maintenance bay. It bore no name, no rank, no date, just 5 engraved words. "The sky remembers its own." A month later, an Air Force documentary crew showed up, asking for interviews. Elias declined every request. "I'm not a story," he said quietly. "Just a man who made a promise." Rumors continued. Some said Ghost had flown backdoor missions that turned wars. Others swore he'd been declared Kia, but was protected under an experimental clearance tier. No one could confirm it, but no one dared dismiss it anymore either. He never wore medals. Not in public, not in private. The few he still possessed, awards given in backrooms and classified briefings, were stored in a rusted ammo box beneath his bed, beside an old black-and-white photo of him and Echo Malin, grinning in front of a fire-scarred jet. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd open that box and sit for hours, not remembering the glory, just the silence after the flight. Because that was what real legends carried. Not the weight of applause, but the memory of those who never got to land.